Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the third round recap of the RA Ottawa December Open. So, in this round, after winning the first two games, I was up for a big task. I was facing the number one seed of the tournament, Grandmaster Bator Sambuev. And it's always an iconic game for me when I play against Bator. He's a three-time Canadian champion, and he's by far one of the most famous and popular chess players in Canada. And previously, I have faced Bator four times. All of them I was playing with the black pieces, and I lost all of those games. So even psychologically, it was like, first of all, I'm playing Grandmaster, and second of all, I lost four games before this one. So psychologically, it's a tough game for me to face a Grandmaster like this. But I was also motivated because I had the white pieces for the first time against him in a classical game. So I kind of wanted to give it my best and try to see what will happen. And I remember before the game, I was in lunch with a friend of mine, and my friend gave me a lot of motivation for this game. My friend told me that it's an afternoon round. He's going to be a little bit more tired, and you have the white pieces. And my friend also gave me a very good advice that I shouldn't try to keep up the pace with him because Batori is kind of a fast player. Like, he's not that sort of player who goes deep in tank and gets into time pressure. So one mistake that I made in my previous encounters against him was that I was trying to keep equal on the clock, and I was getting a little bit tilted, going a little bit down on time. So that also helped. So I went to the game pretty much motivated and energized from winning the first two games, and having the white pieces, I was kind of confident that I can get a positive result. So I started the game with e4, and the first semi-surprise came here when he played the move e6. Of course, like, he has been a French player in most of his career. Like, I know he played it in the big stage in many big competitions, but recently in the last 2 years, I saw Bator playing more of 1e5. So that was the main thing that I prepared in the like 45-minute, 1 hour that I had before the game. And I just briefly had an idea what to do if he goes e6. I didn't really go deep into the lines. So of course I played d4, d5, and here I usually play like three different moves. I play this move bishop d3 a lot of times. It's a tricky line. It's a tricky side line that it's more on the aggressive side. Uh, I very rarely played knight c3 as well. That's my childhood opening that I used to play against the French. But I knew Bator has so much experience in these win-a-war structures when you take on the c3 knight and double my pawns. So I felt like I'm going to get outplayed. So I decided to go for something very solid. So I have this other friend whose name is Sean Rodrigue Lemieux. He's another grandmaster from Canada. And he always gave me this advice that when playing against Bator, you should try to be more solid. You should try to go for end games. And you shouldn't like engage in super complicated tactical battles and also like deep opening battles against him because he's just so good in those sorts of areas. Of course, he's an amazing endgame and positional player as well, but that's basically my best bet against him. So I played the Tarrasch against the French, and my idea was to try and stay more solid. So Bator played c5, and I played knight gf3. So far, so good. I'm defending both pawns, and he plays this move knight f6. I take on d5, and now he decides to take with the e pawn. So after the game, we were talking, and he was criticizing the opening choice that he had, and he was thinking maybe it was better to take with a knight because that will give him much better chances to create some play and play for the win. And he also mentioned that with ed5, he had been pretty solid over the years, maybe like lost only 2 games, including this game, in over like 40 games that he played this structure. So it's a line that he had a lot of experience in, but simply it's difficult for black to create winning chances if white tries to stay solid. So I was still in prep, of course. I played bishop e5 check, bishop d7. I traded the bishops. and now I castle, waiting for my opponent to develop the bishop on e7, and now I take on c5, he takes back, and now we get some sort of an IQP structure. So I have a history with Bator playing these sorts of IQP structures. Generally, he's a player who loves playing with the IQP, the isolated queen's pawn, and I'm a player who loves to play against the IQP. So naturally speaking, these games usually tend to go in this way where I'm playing against his IQP. I had maybe like 2 or 3 games before this where I tried to grind this IQP against him, but every single time he was able to generate some sort of attack against my king, and then my position started getting into trouble. But this time I had the white pieces. So when you have the white pieces, it's more difficult for him to attack my king. Like, white actually has some sort of slight advantage, and with correct play, I should be fine. So I played knight b3, knight c4, and knight fd4. And the idea is simply to blockade the IQP, like very typical in playing against the IQP, to try and blockade it. And the other idea is that this knight on e4 is pretty strong, so naturally I would like to play this move f3 and try to kick the knight away. So he played queen d7, and here I made the first slight inaccuracy. This was the first moment that I was out of prep, and I decided to play the move c3, which to me sounded like a very natural move, consolidating the knight on d4, and it looked like it's definitely a useful move. Like, it can't be bad. And after the game, he was telling me, actually the next day, that the main line goes f3, kicking the knight away, knight d6, knight c5, queen c7, knight d3. So I reroute the knight like what I did in the game, but after castles, I don't play the move c3. I play the move b3. And this is the main way to counter this line of the French. And the idea is I want to put this bishop on b2 and kind of restrict the knight on d6 and not let this knight get into a strong outpost on c4. I actually went a little bit deeper in this line, and it's funny that after a move like rook f8, which is a natural move, bishop b2 is actually not a good move because it runs into an insane tactic knight c4. And actually the best move is just to drop back the bishop now. But if I take, and he takes, and I go back, he goes c3, I go back, and now rook d8. With queen c4 and bishop c5 coming, I can't really save my piece, and I'm already much worse. So after rook f8, the best move is actually to play the move bishop to e3. And white has a small advantage, and the idea with b3 here is more like not to put the bishop on b2, but to restrict the knight on d6. Anyways, I played c3, which has been played only once in 283 times that this position was reached. But I don't think it's that bad of a move. He castled, and now I went with the typical idea, f3, kicking the knight, and then rerouting the knight to d3, rook f8, rook e1. I'm playing very normal moves and I'm trying not to give him any sort of counterplay. But now he plays knight c4, and now you can kind of see the drawback of playing c3 compared to b3. While with b3, the knight is kind of restricted on d6. Now this knight on c4 is kind of putting pressure on my queen side. So here you might ask, why not go b3 here? But the problem is if I go b3 now, the pawn on c3 is going to start becoming weak, and my opponent can put so much pressure down the c file against this pawn. Anyways, I played bishop f4, normal move, and here he made a slight inaccuracy with queen b6. The best move was just to go bishop d6, and after a bunch of trades, we get to some sort of position like this, which I still prefer white a little bit because of the long-term pressure against the IQP, but it's just one weakness. I can't really create a second weakness to put more pressure on him. At the same time, his knight on c4 is pretty strong. He has so much activity. So the likeliest result in this position, where there's no bishops as well, it's going to be a draw. Like, I'm not saying it's a dead draw or anything, but draw is a very likely result in this position. So he played queen b6, and after the game, he actually told me that he played this move and missed queen b3, which was my response, because he's so used to playing with the pawns on c2 and b3. And usually with a pawns on c2 and b3, this queen b3 is never an idea. But after queen b3, all of a sudden, he's kind of forced to trade the queens. He can go queen a6, but then I can offer the queen trade again. So he played bishop f8, and I instantly remembered what Sean told me, that I should try and trade queens against Bator, and that's the best way to put pressure on him. So I was pretty happy to get into this endgame, and I was very happy to get this position, especially against a higher rated player. Like against a low rated, I might be a little bit hesitant to go into a position like this. And the reason is, even though white is slightly better, the drawing margin is pretty high in these sorts of endgames. And I sometimes want to test my low rated opponents in more tactical battles. Like I want to test them in like all areas of the game. I don't want to go straight into an endgame. I want to test them in calculation, in tactics, before giving them a full point. But against Bator, I was very happy to get such a position because I was like, it's an equal position. There's a very low chance that I lose this game because it's kind of a risk-free endgame for me where I can press against the isolated pawn. And yeah, if he can make a draw, then I'm still not sad about that. Draw against the Grandmaster is never a bad result. It's not like I was playing for a draw, but I was also not unhappy about the draw, of course. So I played a very good move here, bishop g3. One thing that was annoying me in this position was this move knight h5 in some lines. Like I was always thinking, if he goes knight h5, it's going to be difficult in some lines to reroute this bishop to f2. And if I put this bishop on d2, it might get attacked by the knight on c4 again. And if I go bishop g5, maybe I can do this, but it's still going to take a lot of time. He might get bishop d6, knight f4. So I really like this move, bishop g3. And it's a multifunctional move. I want to reroute the bishop to f2, and I also want to trade the rooks on the e file. So he played knight a4, normal move, putting pressure on my pawns. And now I decided to trade the rooks and go rook e1. So this was not objectively the best move, and Bator was criticizing this move a little bit, that it doesn't give that much winning chances after the game. But something that's the best objectively is a little bit difficult in my eyes to play. So the best is to keep one pair of rooks, but I felt like with a pressure down the e-file, it's not that easy to always keep this rook. But the idea that I checked with the computer is to bring the king. First of all, make sure that there's no entry for black's rook. And once he starts activating the bishop, I drop the knight back and I play bishop f2. And now I'm kind of trying to highlight that this knight on a4 is almost getting trapped. Like for instance, if he goes a6 after b3, the knight is trapped. And if he doesn't, I can slowly go rook c1, rook c2, and then start to kick this knight with b3, maybe even give up the bishop to compromise his pawn structure a little bit more, and then start to play for the win. This rook might also come to d1 maybe to put some pressure on the IQP, but I decided to go rook e1. And here, Bator made a mistake, which comes from something that he has, which is a strength and a weakness at the same time. Like, Bator always wants to play for the win, especially against the low-rated players. Like, he's a very fighting player. He always wants to create chances. He doesn't want to just get stuck in a dry endgame and just defend for a draw against the low-rated. So, understandably, he goes rook c8. He doesn't want to trade the rooks, because if he takes and then goes knight c5, which is the top engine line, he just gets such an endgame where there's zero chances of winning, and he needs to defend having an IQP. I don't think the defensive task is brutally difficult, but again, psychologically speaking, even for me, when I play a low-rated player, it's always a tough decision to just go into an endgame where I have no winning chances, and I just need to play like 10, 20 more accurate moves to force a draw. So he played rook c8, trying to keep the rooks, but that's a big mistake. Now I play this great move, knight f5. And all of a sudden, he's in some sort of trouble, because knight e7 check is coming. And if he takes the bishop, I'm going to take with a rook, and all of a sudden, these pawns are getting harassed on the 7th rank. So after a long thing, he decided to just bring the rook back and admit to his mistake. After the game, we were talking about this move rook c6 to try and put some pressure on the b2 pawn. So I was suggesting this move bishop f2, but then he pointed out that rook e6 was a nice idea. So you defend against knight e7, and I can't really take on a7 at the same time. But I had this move knight e7, which I also saw. But after bishop takes rook b6, we were talking about this position, and we were like, this just looks wrong for black. This looks a little bit sketchy, and in fact, we saw that I had bishop f2, rook back to b5, not rook back to b5, but rook to b5, and now b3. Now the knight should go back, and I take the pawn, and if he takes on c3, now rook c7, attacking the knight and threatening the back rank checkmate, and white is completely winning. So understandably, after knight f5, he was so scared of knight e7, and correctly so, and he decided to go rook e8. Rook takes c8, knight takes c8, and now he gets a much worse version of that endgame. Like, with taking on e1, he could have gotten a much better version with my bishop more passive, without wasting two tempos, with rook c8, rook e8. But now he got this version, and this is a little bit unpleasant. Like, he has the IQP, and I have more active pieces. That kind of puts some pressure on him to hold this. So I made an inaccuracy. I played bishop f2, which looked normal, attacking the pawn on a7 and putting pressure on these queenside pawns. But yeah, the best move here was to play bishop e5, and I will show you why. The idea with bishop e5 is to put this bishop on d4 and attack the pawn. You might ask, what's the main difference? Like, let me show you this line first. He goes g6, kick the knight. I go knight e3, attack the pawn on d5. He defends it. I attack the knight, threatening to take and then take on d5. And after knight c7, I go knight f4. And all of a sudden, the threat of bishop takes b6, knight takes d5 is unstoppable. And I'm almost in a winning position in this line. But when I played bishop f2, g6, knight e3, if I want to go for the same idea to attack the pawn on d5, it doesn't work here. Because if you had played the right move, knight b6, knight f4, knight c7, now this bishop is blocked by the knights. I can't really attack any of these knights without lifting the pressure on the d5 pawn. So this would have still been a little bit unpleasant for black, but probably pretty much easily holdable. So he played knight c7, which was a huge inaccuracy. And he pointed out after the game that he missed that after bishop g3, he can't play this move bishop h6, counterattacking the knight, but he missed this move knight g4, which just wins the piece. In the game when he played this, honestly, I thought his idea is what happened in the game. So I calculated this line, bishop g3, knight e6, I win the pawn, but now he plays knight c5. And all of a sudden, it's not so easy because I can't really defend my knight because of a5 here and g5 here. And I might even like lose a piece if I'm not careful. And the knight is hanging. If I move the knight away, I lose this pawn. So I'm in some sort of a trouble here. Not trouble, I would say, but it's more like I'm losing the pawn back. It's not like I can keep my pawn on b2 safe in any of the lines. But coming to this position, first of all, I saw that if I take on c5 and then trade the bishops and lose this pawn, in a knight endgame, my king is going to be more active. So I was pretty sure that in the resulting knight endgame, I wasn't sure how good that is, but I was sure that I'm not going to be in danger of losing the game. So I made a very nice move. I played knight f6 check, king g7, and knight e8 check, and king g8. So you might ask, why did I move my knight from an amazing d5 square to a square on e8? This looks a little bit odd. So Bator told me that he initially thought that maybe I'm trying to go for a draw. And I was kind of thinking about it, but I felt like the endgame that I'm now going to go for is not going to be losing in any way. And I'd rather play this and learn something than taking a quick draw here with knight f6, knight e8. So I decided to go for the win. And I played the move knight takes c5. So he took back, bishop f2. And here he blitzed the move, which I also thought it was completely automatic, but it's a big mistake. He took on f2 and then took on b2, and we got this knight endgame. What he should have done was the move b6. And the point is, you don't take this pawn right away, and that's basically the downside of this move knight e8. Like, in the bishop in a knight endgame, the knight is much better on e8 compared to d5. But the downside of the knight on e8 is that he can calmly go b6, and now I can't really save this b pawn. If I push, the c3 pawn is going to be hanging, and if I go with this, now in this endgame, white is still slightly better because of the active king, but now black's structure is, even though the pawns are isolated, but they are much harder to attack compared to what happened in the game. So he played the automatic move, bishop takes f2, king takes f2, knight takes b2, and now king e3. Here I was starting to feel a little bit confident because all of a sudden my threat is to play knight e6, attacking the pawn on b7, and if b6, then knight c8. And I'm basically threatening to win a pawn. And once I win a pawn, there's this famous saying that knight endgames are like pawn endgames. And if it's not as easy as this, of course, but usually if you get a knight endgame where without the knights it's winning, with the knights there's also a high chance that it's winning in many cases. But of course it's 10 times more tricky. So if my opponent plays a move like king f8, it runs into something like knight d6, b6, king d4, knight a4, knight b5, and these pawns are just way too vulnerable. And the king is so passive. Like, let's say he tries to save the pawns. My king is getting into a c6 square, tying the knight down to the defense of the pawn. And then at the right moment, I'm going to start pushing the pawns, rerouting the knights. And it's just a very unpleasant, basically losing position for black because everything is passive and stuck. So he played knight c4. I activated the king. And here he made an inaccuracy by playing knight a5. And I'm not even sure whether I can call this an inaccuracy because the best move is king f8. We actually discussed this after the game. And what I was planning to do against king f8 was to go knight f6, attacking the h7 pawn and the knight. And once the knight retreats, I take, and then maybe start pushing these pawns on the king's side. But apparently this offers excellent holding chances for black because I need to waste some tempos, bring this knight back too. But I understand why he didn't go for this. This just looks a little bit scary with the extra outside passer. And there's also this interesting line which I checked with computer after king takes c4, king takes c8, king d5. Apparently the pawn endgame is also winning. I wasn't sure about that. Like, I guess we can analyze this pawn endgame in detail as well, which I don't want to do. But I think the idea is that I just get these pawns forward and try to gain as much space as I can. And the problem with him is that if he puts the king on d7, he really doesn't want to push these pawns forward because then once he runs out of pawn moves, I can penetrate with a king. And I'm basically winning in this pawn endgame because of the active position of my king and because he's probably going to run out of pawn moves first. And then the king will eventually penetrate somehow. Or maybe if the king goes here, I can go c6 and penetrate from this side. But of course, there's a lot to analyze in this pawn endgame too. And I probably would have played knight f6 here. So he played knight a5, and his idea is to keep defending this pawn on b7. But the problem with this is that he's now losing so much tempo with the knight. And now my king marches forward. I play king c5, knight c6, and now king d6, which is slightly inaccurate. But again, the best move is to go knight d6, which I saw during the game. But after knight d8, I wasn't 100% sure how to make progress. Apparently, I should just keep attacking this pawn. And the thing is, a move like a6 will allow my king to come to b6, which is an amazing square. So he probably has to play like that. And now any sort of pawn endgame is, of course, winning for me. So he has to play like this. And now the king goes there and collects the pawns. Like, I would say this was findable. I don't know exactly why I didn't go for it, but I was pretty convinced with king d6 too. Now my king is marching towards the pawns and it's trying to win them. King f8 was played. I played knight f6, h5, king c7. knight a5, and now the king goes to b8. So it was amazing. Like my king went all the way from g1 to b8, and you see this king comes all the way back to a2 again. Very active king in this game. Now I'm attacking the pawn on a7. He can't defend it like this because b7 is also hanging. And if he goes a6, now my king comes to b6 and kicks the knight to win these pawns. So understandably, he tried to activate his pieces with tempo. He played king e7, I played knight e4, f5, knight c5, attacking the pawn on b7, now b6. So he's improving his position with tempo, but there's a downside to this move f5. The point is, after knight d3, all of a sudden, these pawns are also very weak. So I saw that if I play like this, if he goes something like knight c6, king b7, king d6, and tries to hold on to the queenside pawns, now I have this amazing move h4, crippling these pawns on the king side, and now knight f4 is coming to win the pawns, and this knight is simply overloaded. It can't defend these pawns and these pawns at the same time. So understandably, he was scared of this move h4 with knight f4, and he played g5. But that loses a pawn, knight c4, and now the king comes back to try and hit the knight again. Here, 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 and he can't go king d5 because of knight b4 check, losing the knight. But he played knight e3, and here I was starting to get a little bit nervous. So I took the b6 pawn, and the problem here is that not knight takes g2, because if knight takes g2, obviously this pawn is going to start going like c3, c5, and like with two passers on the outside, I don't think there's enough counterplay on this side of the board that can save the game. Knight takes g2, c4 is just game over, basically. So he played this move knight d5, which I saw. And now the problem is he's attacking my pawn on c3, and if I try to get my king back to the center, the thing is, now this knight takes c3 comes with check, and my pawn on a2 is also hanging. But when I played this line, I calculated until a good point. So I played king b5, giving the pawn on c3 and giving the pawn on a2. But the point is, his knight is trapped on the edge of the board. So another line can go knight e2 if he tries to like keep the knight. But the problem is the distant passer is just too strong. Like I will basically activate my knight, and if the king tries to spend so much time winning this pawn, I'll probably have much faster attack here on this side of the board, and I will probably round up the pawns. I also have this idea of king b5, a5, a6 to try and maybe promote the pawn. So this is also losing. I think he went for the best practical approach. Knight takes a2, king b3, king d5, I take the knight, and now king d4. And all of a sudden, it doesn't look that easy. I'm up a full piece, but my king is way too passive. Like, it's way off the action, and I should do everything I want to do with my knight and the pawns. And I remember when going for this line, I saw the winning move from distance. I almost instantly played this amazing move f4. And the idea is that he can't really take because I take on g5 and the pawn promotes. And if he goes g4, now my knight has this nice e5 square. So I can show you a bunch of lines that I saw during the game and we discussed at the analysis in the post-mortem. One line is to go g4 for him, and the only winning move is knight e5. So now black has two approaches. One approach is to go with the king and try to win the h2 pawn. And in this case, if the king goes all the way, my knight gets to h4 in time, and I take on f5 and everything is guarded. There's no counterplay left. h4 I just take and sack the knight. And the knight forever defends the g3 pawn. He's never going to be in time. So the more dangerous line that I was scared of was ideas with the move h4. But then I saw that I have this nice knight sacrifice. Knight takes g4. And he has to take. And now I play g3. So I basically have this protected passer on f4. And if he just waits, I'm going to just slowly bring my king and win the game with my protected passer. That's not going to be difficult. So his two attempts to not let me do that is to try and go for the counterplay. If he takes and goes like this, then as you can see, he's one tempo short, and with a g-pawn, of course, g-pawn on the second rank against the queen, it's always losing wherever the king is, because white can force the king in front of the pawn with a series of checks. Like, I can show you one idea. Like, let's say here, check, king f2, check, here, queen g3, king f1, check, king g1. And now once the king is forced in front, then you can bring the king one step forward, and you rinse and repeat the same process until your king gets close enough to round up the pawn. So this was one line. And the other line that I saw was this idea of playing h3. And this time the king goes for the h2 pawn. But again, it's a little bit too slow. f5, king g2, f6 takes, f7 takes, and f8. And black is just way too slow. If h2, I just go queen f1, and I control both pawns, and there's nothing that he can do. There was this other line that he pointed out in the analysis, which I completely forgot. And it's actually a very challenging line, and that's the move g3. I totally missed this move in my calculations. And the idea is to sack the pawn and now bring the king. And the win is actually not so easy. I actually managed to find it during the analysis, but it's a little bit tricky. I bring the king, king f2, and now the only winning move is to go g4. He can't take with the f pawn because the pawn promotes. And if he takes with the h pawn, now it's sack the knight again. If fg4, again, we get to the same situation with queen versus the g pawn on the second rank. But he was suggesting king g3. But now I have this nice maneuver. Knight e3, king f4, and now knight f1. And now the knight and the pawn form an unimpenetrable wall in front of the king. And if the king comes from here, the king is in time to guard all the squares. And the only thing that's left for him is to try something like king g4, king c2, f4, king d2, f3. But this is not going to work because I simply give a check and I take with a pawn. And the knight defends the pawn from behind. So if the king takes it, then the f pawn is just going to promote. So yeah, that was another interesting line with knight f1, just completely forming a wall in front of the king. And white will be winning. This actually was proud to be able to find during the analysis. But anyways, in the game, he didn't go for g4. He went with another tricky approach, which was g takes f4. I took with a knight, and now he played h4. And here I slowly started getting nervous. I was like, did I just mess this up? I was pretty sure there should be a win, but I couldn't find it. Apparently, like, he told me after the game that it was very easy to win with a move like knight g6. I was a little bit scared of h3 takes king e4 with this f-pawn coming down the board. But the way to win this is to just simply bring the king. And my king is just fast enough to control the pawn. So this was, I think, the easiest way to win. But I found another way. I played h3, fixing the pawn on h4. And I knew that the tricky line is king e3, knight g6, king f2, knight takes h4, and now f4. And still, it doesn't look so clear, because now he's threatening to go king g3, kick my knight, and now take on g2. So here I remember I spent all of my time just to make sure I'm not making a mistake. Like, I almost made a blunder with a fancy move here. I was thinking g4 is winning for a moment, thinking that after fg3, my knight is in a good position to hold the g-pawn. Like, let's say after king b3, I was thinking if he goes g2, I will take, and now my knight defends the pawn from behind again, and it's winning. Correctly so, but then I realized king g1, and the king is just coming to win the pawn, and I can't do much about it. I also saw, like, after g4, I have this, and I was like, I'm winning by one tempo, g7, king f3, g8 queen, king takes c3. And you know, with the f-pawn, on the second rank, it's sometimes tricky because of some stalemate ideas. Like, let's say the queen gives a check on g3 to the king on g1, then the king can go to h1. It doesn't have to blockade the f-pawn. But I saw that I have this move queen c4, just putting the queen in front of the pawn, and that should be winning. So I saw all of these, but then I realized, okay, here there's king g1, so it doesn't work. So I was like, let's spend all of my time to make 100% sure that what I'm going for is winning. And I saw that the win is actually pretty simple. King b3, king g3, and now if I try to just bring the king, it's going to be a blunder because he's going to take king d4, king g3, king e4, and I'm just one tempo short. He's going to take, and take. That's going to be a draw. But I found the only winning move here, and that's the move. If you guys want to, you can maybe pause the video and try to find the win. The win is knight f5 check, king takes g2, and simply h4, f3, h5, f2. And it looks as though this pawn is getting dangerous, but the point is I go knight e3 check. Now, if he goes king g1, I simply push the pawn and win the game. And if he goes king f3, now knight f1. And now king e2 is met by knight h2, and king g2 is met by knight d2. And there's not much black can do. After such a move, then it's going to take like 2 or 3 more tempos to attack this knight again. So understandably, after knight e3 check, my opponent resigned, and I got a very valuable win. It was valuable in many senses. So first of all, Bator is a Canadian legend, like 3 times Canadian champion. It's always enjoyable to win a chess game against such a strong player. And also, I always say that previously, I have beaten most of the Canadian top active players in classical games. And Bator was the only player that I played 4 times against, and I lost every single time. So winning this game was very valuable for me. It made me really happy. It made me motivated. And yeah, I should also like give a huge shout out to Bator, which generously agreed to analyze the game after it finished. Like, one thing that I really want to mention, I beat 2 GMs so far. This is my 2nd ever Grandmaster win. And one thing that impressed me about both of these Grandmasters, both Bator and Razvan Priotu, 2 Canadian Grandmasters, was that both of them were really willing to analyze the game afterwards. You see many players, even like lower rated players, when they lose the game, they're just so mad. They don't want to like learn from their mistakes. But you can see this mentality in the Grandmasters that they want to use every single opportunity to learn something new. They want to analyze. They want to find ideas. Like, it was very amazing to see Bator trying his best to find a draw for black in this knight endgame. Like, he was genuinely enjoying analyzing this position in detail. And that shows this mentality that grandmasters have, which made them a grandmaster. Like, of course, there are a lot of factors, but this mentality of constant improvement, constant learning is something that I think I should take away from the grandmasters as well. You can always see them wanting to analyze, wanting to learn, wanting to improve on their mistakes. But anyways, I won this game, very big win. I got to 3 out of 3, and this is a sort of win that gives me a lot of confidence. And going into the next round, I was now playing on the top board, and I was one of the main contenders to win the tournament. So thank you so much, guys, for watching. I hope you enjoyed this recap, and I hope you enjoyed the analysis. There's still 2 more games to cover, which I will do in the next videos. So please make sure to smash that like button on the video, subscribe to the channel, and wait for the next rounds to come. There are still 2 more games to go, and I will face more strong players in the next 2 rounds. Thank you so much, guys, for watching. Make sure to share your thoughts about this game in the comments down below, and I really appreciate every one of you in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. See you soon.